So now, in the history, we have already understood that Central Board of Revenue in the year 1964 was divided into Central Board of Direct Taxes and Central Board of Excise and Custom. Now, let's understand. And Central Board of Direct Tax was responsible for collection of direct taxes in India, and Central Board of Excise and Custom is responsible for indirect taxes. Now let's understand the difference between direct tax and indirect tax. First, for that, let's understand what is direct tax. When tax is borne by the person on whom it is levied or imposed, it is known as direct tax. For an example, Mr. Ram has a building. Mr. Ram has a two-story building and the ground floor was given on rent by Mr. Ram. On the rent collected per annum is rupees 5 lakhs. On the 5 lakh, Mr. Ram has to pay supposedly a tax of around 10,000 to the government. The tax of 10,000 is to be paid by Mr. Ram directly to the government. Directly to the government, 10,000 rupees. Here we see that tax of 10,000 was levied. The tax of 10,000 was levied on Mr. Ram, and Mr. Ram has directly paid the tax to the government. So here, by the definition, we say when tax is borne by the person on whom it is imposed, then it is known as direct tax. Now, supposingly, let's take one more example. Mr. Ram also has a restaurant. Mr. Ram runs a restaurant. Runs a restaurant. In the restaurant, Mr. Ram makes a profit of supposedly 10 lakh. On this 10 lakh, Mr. Ram has to pay tax of supposedly 1 lakh rupees to the government. So the tax is to be paid by Mr. Ram to the government directly. The tax which was paid is directly out of his own pocket, and hence it is known as direct tax. Now, what is indirect tax? Indirect tax, as the name suggests, when tax is paid by indirectly by a person, it is known as indirect tax. Let's understand. So, indirect tax when tax is imposed on one but borne by someone else, it is known as indirect tax. For an example, let's understand for an example. The same restaurant example, Mr. Ram has the restaurant. Shyam comes to the restaurant of Mr. Ram and has bought food. Bought food. Mr. Ram makes a bill. Mr. Ram makes a bill of 500 for the food plus taxes of rupees 100. Mr. Shyam pays Mr. Ram 500 plus 100 rupees for the tax. Mr. Ram now has collected rupees 100 towards the tax from Mr. Shyam. Tax, since it belongs to the government, Mr. Ram deposits this 100 rupees tax collected from Shyam to the government. In this we see the tax was actually imposed on Mr. Ram. Mr. Ram had to collect, but it was borne out of the pocket of Mr. Shyam, and hence we call it indirect tax. So now, having understood direct tax and indirect tax, how can we summarize? Summary: imposed on and borne by. When tax is imposed on Mr. Ram and actually paid or borne by Mr. Ram, then it is known as direct tax. When tax is imposed on Mr. Ram but actually borne out of the pocket of Mr. Shyam, it is known as indirect tax. Excuse me.